Welcome to the Monday Study. This is Practical Apologetics, Session 2, Does God Exist? You can get notes for this series and more information about other studies by John Gifford at themondaystudy.org or .com. God bless.
God has gone to great lengths to make himself known to those who will look. And so he wants us to know him, and he wants us to know that he exists. It's the ultimate question that we have to answer, because the answer to that question will set you for the rest of your existence. If you believe that in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, then everything else is possible. You have no problem with miracles because God created the heavens and the earth. You have no problem with resurrection from the dead because God created the heavens and the earth. You have no problem knowing that you will live forever with him in heaven because God created the heaven and the earth. If you don't believe God exists, then you can believe none of those things. And so it is really the ultimate question, or at least we think it is. Now, a few years ago, there was a book that came out and then a movie that followed. It was called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was pretty funny. It was there was one part of this book and the movie where they come to what they think is a planet. And this planet is not really a planet. It's a planet-sized computer. And it's called Deep Thought. That's the name of the computer. And it was made by a race of beings who got tired of listening to people debate about what the ultimate question of the universe is. And so they built this massive supercomputer, and they gave it the task to go and find out what the answer is to the ultimate question of the universe. And so by the time they get there, this computer had been working on this problem for 7.5 million years. And it finally spit out an answer. And they were there to witness this. And so the ultimate answer to the questions of the universe, it spit out the answer, and the answer was 42. And they asked the computer, this is the answer is 42? It is right. What's the question? The computer says, nobody remembers what the question was. The answer is 42. So what's the answer to our ultimate question? Does God exist? Let me say this very clearly. God exists. Now, for those of us who have been born again and by faith, we don't doubt that. Well, there's times that we may have questions, but we don't doubt that. We know that God exists because there is a witness in our own heart and spirit. The Holy Spirit speaks to us and lets us know. But how do you prove that to somebody who is not saved? Somebody who's not born again? Somebody who maybe has gone through too much college. As my dad used to say, someone who is educated beyond their intelligence. You can show with a preponderance of the evidence, as we talked about last week, that God exists. How do you do that? One of the quotes that I have for you is from Jesus himself in John chapter 3, verse 8, talking to Nicodemus. Nicodemus is questioning whether or not, or what being born again is all about. And Jesus gives him a very interesting answer. He says this, he says, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it goes. And then he goes on to explain that the Holy Spirit does the work. What's he saying? He's saying this. None of us can go outside and say, I've seen the wind. Anybody here seen the wind? No, you don't see the wind. What do you see? You see the effects of the wind. You see what it does. You can see the leaves rustling in the trees. You can see the dust blowing. You can see the fields of grain if you see those waving as the wind. You're not seeing the wind. You're seeing the effect of the wind. And that's exactly what Jesus was saying. You know the wind exists because you see the effect of it. You know that someone is saved, born again, because you see the effect of the Holy Spirit working in their life. But by the same token, we can take a look at the things that exist, and we can see whether or not from those we can find out whether God does, in fact, exist. So let me give you some things that we can start talking about. The fingerprints of creation, the things that are made. Paul said this. He said that the invisible things of God, are clearly seen by the things which are made, even his eternal power and his divine nature. Romans 1. We know from the things that are made. In fact, the next verse says, so that men are without excuse. God is going to hold us accountable for knowing that He exists. Psalm 19 says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And as we'll see later on, they utter speech day in and day out. They speak to us about the Creator. So how do they do that? Well, in 1905, every scientist of note believed that the universe was infinite and eternal, that it had always existed and that it was infinite in size. That's what their equations told them. That's what their paradigms taught them. That's what they believed from the earliest times of Galileo and Newton. And they didn't have any reason to doubt that until this little German patent clerk came along and he wrote a paper about the special theory of relativity. And this was the equation that it boiled down to. We've all seen it, E equals mc squared. But the thing about this equation is that it was comparing and contrasting time and space. Time and space. And the conclusion of this investigation by Einstein was that time and space had a beginning. There was a time when there was no time and no space. And matter and time and energy all had a beginning, which means that at some point in time the universe had a beginning. It was not eternal. It was not infinite. It was in fact finite and had a beginning. And this was a huge revelation. And the scientific community, I can tell you, they took his paper, and it was not well received in the beginning. They really didn't want to think that the universe had a beginning because they knew that as soon as you say that the universe had a beginning, then the next question is, how did it begin? And if you think about it long enough, we'll see in a minute, there is a law of physics called the first cause. There is no effect without a cause. There was always cause and effect. There is no case in our history. We have never observed anything else. For every effect, there is a cause. So everything that comes into being had to come into being or had to exist based on some cause that made it come into existence. And so what was worse about this is they began to investigate these equations and look at the significance of it. And not only did they find out that there was a beginning, but these equations pointed out the fact that before the beginning, there was nothing. Nothing at all. In other words, the universe came into being from nothing. Now, what is nothing? You know what nothing is? Definition of nothing is a zero with the edges rubbed out. And so the implication of that was tremendous in the scientific community, and they wrestled with this. And I can tell you that up until 1919, this was some 14 years later, they really didn't have any proof that Einstein's equations were correct. The mathematics seemed to work out, except for one thing which I'll talk about in a minute. But they seemed to work out, and the first proof came in 1919 when, based on Einstein's equations, they realized that light would bend around a massive object. And so during an eclipse in 1919, they took photographs, and they were able to show that, yes, in fact, the stars behind the sun after the eclipse took place, by measuring their positions, they found out that light, in fact, did bend around the sun, and the position of those stars behind the sun were skewed. That was one of the first things, and then they went on. Einstein did not like the fact that his equations showed that the universe was finite and had a beginning. To him, it was, his words, irritating. It was irritating. Again, this was a paradigm that they'd have, and let me say this. Scientists are human beings. They don't like change. A lot of them spend their whole life studying a certain area of discipline like physics, and they've been taught, they've gone through all of their schooling, they've gotten their degree in physics, they've got their endowed chair at the university, they've got all this stuff to find out that what they believed was wrong is not a happy thing. And neither are they anxious to make that change. It's so much so that one of the scientists said that to him, the idea of the universe having a beginning was repugnant. And he would very much like to find a genuine loophole. He wants to find something that would prove that it was not true. Why? Because when you take this to its logical conclusion, something started the universe. Cause and effect. Something started the universe. And whatever this was outside of time and space. Because before the universe began, we all hear about the Big Bang, and some of you even watch the show. You know, you get the Big Bang, and it takes place, and you always read these scientific articles, and they'll talk about the first milliseconds after the Big Bang, this was the condition. And then, 5 minutes after the Big Bang, and they go through all this. And there's books written on, there's all kinds of illustrations. What they never talk about is what it was like before the Big Bang, because they have no idea. Because there's nothing there. But what they do know is there was nothing at all. Zero with the edges rubbed out, and then it exploded. And how do you explain that? There's only one way to explain it. There is a cause which is outside of time and space. A cause which is not affected by time and space because time and space had a beginning. It's not affected by it. It's outside. Now, the question is, what is that cause? As we'll see tonight, the evidence points to an intelligent creator. Someone who controlled that explosion. Someone who caused that explosion to come into being and who fine-tuned the universe in such a way that we are possible. And it's so finely tuned that if it's off by 1 part in 10 to the minus 37th, it means a 1 with 37 zeros in front of it and then a period. That's a really small amount. If it's off by 1 part in that, then we couldn't exist because gravity would be too strong or it'd be too weak, and the universe couldn't exist as we know it now. There's dozens of these things. So Einstein's theory changed the way we thought about the universe. And it changed so much that science has been grappling with it now for the last 100 or so years, trying to come up with what this means and how it works. One thing that they have found out is that as repugnant to some as this theory is, that there is a beginning to the universe, what they have found out is that it is absolutely, without question, true. Because all the math works. They have proven Einstein's theories all the way from black holes to time dilation to all kinds of things down to 5 decimal points. They've proven what he has theorized and the equations that come from that to a very, very high degree. Just as an aside, this equation points out that time and mass are relative, which means that the farther you get away from a massive object, the faster time becomes. And so the farther you get away, time will speed up, and then you get closer to a massive object, time will slow down. Which I've always pointed out for those of us that are overweight, it means that time goes by more slowly for us. If you want to live longer, have another cupcake. It's physics. All you skinny people, you're going to be dead before you know it. Just saying. You can't argue with it. It's physics. So all space, matter, and time had a beginning. Everything had to come into existence from nothing. And we're going to see, we can extrapolate from that what the Creator must be like as we go through this. So let me talk about a couple other things that have to do with this. Laws of physics. When we say laws of physics, these are just observations that scientists have made over the years as they observe the way the universe works. And so as we observe these things in nature, we observe some things that are true. They're always true, and so we call those laws. One of those laws is called the first law of thermodynamics. What is that? The first law of thermodynamics is this. This means that energy can be converted to mass. And mass can be converted to energy. They work both ways. So the equation works both ways. You can convert energy to mass, mass to energy. We know this is true because if you take an atomic bomb, which is mass, and you do certain things to it, and you break the energy bonds within a uranium-238 atom, it creates energy. A lot of energy. You realize that first nuclear explosion that you see pictures of in school, that first test of the bomb during World War II, And the reality is that when they exploded that, when they caused the implosion which caused the nuclear reaction, less than 1% of that mass was used in the explosion. Less than 1%. And you saw the size of the explosion. What that means is it takes that much energy to create that much mass. It's an incredible amount of energy. This is the speed of light squared. And so, make sure I get this right because he's watching me. All right. So if I want to come up with mass, then I just divide this by the speed of light squared, and then I get mass, right? Okay. But the speed of light squared is a humongous number. It's a huge number. It's 186,000 miles per second times 186,000 miles per second. It's this huge number. So the amount of mass we get with energy is very small in ratio, which means that I have to have a tremendous amount of energy to create mass. How much energy did it take to create this solar system? Do you realize how small we are in comparison to the galaxy? How much energy did it take to create the universe? If you ever wonder if God is powerful, we have no idea. No idea. You know how he did it, by the way? He stepped out and said, "Let there be light." And I love this in Hebrew because that's not what he says in Hebrew. In Hebrew, he steps out and he goes, "Light be," and light was. He doesn't mess around. He says, "Light be," light was. It had no choice. So this first law of thermodynamics says that there is a set amount of energy and mass in the universe, and we can have no more and no less. The matter and energy in the universe is set. You can have no more, you can have no less. You can convert it back and forth, but you can't have more and you can have less. It is interesting that in the book of Genesis, it says that God rested and he finished his work, which in Hebrew means he was done, he quit creating, and he rested on the seventh day. What does that mean? It means no more mass, no more energy. He set it in the universe, and that's it. So the law of thermodynamics, the first one says, no more mass, no more energy, and it's exactly what God said happened. And then the second law of thermodynamics, I love this one. The second law is this, and that is that everything begins to decay. There is entropy. That is, it goes from order to disorder. All of us men know that. Look at your sock drawer sometime. Order, disorder. Look at your garage. Anybody come and look at my garage. I have a bunch of tools, and they're almost always all over everything. So it goes from order to disorder. And it talks about the same thing in the universe, this entropy, from order to disorder, which means that at some time in the beginning, everything was very, very orderly. That's why God looked at the things that he made and he said, "It is good." And then he says, "It is very good." What does it mean? It means God was satisfied with his creation. It was good. It was orderly. In fact, we'll talk a little bit next week about Genesis and compare some of these things. What we find out when it talks about the evening and the morning, or the first day, evening, morning, second day, those particular terms in Hebrew have to do with going from disorder to order as God builds his creation. It is interesting that the Apostle Paul, in talking about the creation, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, says something that is actually it's mind-blowing. He infers that the creation that God made, he intended to operate without the second law of thermodynamics. He intended it to operate without decay and without winding down. He made it to remain. But what the Apostle Paul says is because of the sin of Adam, because of the fall of mankind, not only did mankind fall from their place of grace with God, he says, but the entire creation was subject to vanity, and the word there is emptiness, and it was made emptiness, and it was subjected to frustration. And the inference here is entropy. Entropy came into being because Adam messed up. So what Paul is saying is, not only did he have the effect on us, but the entire universe stopped its normal existence and began to wind down. I find that very, very controversial. But I also find it true, because as we get to the book of Revelation, when we get to the end, what happens? God says, I make a new heaven and a new earth. This heaven and earth are winding down because of sin. He will not keep this universe the way it is. He will make a new heaven and a new earth, and then we'll go on from there, and it will last forever. All right, so there's a first cause. Now, what's the problem? We all know that nothing comes from nothing. We know that there was nothing, and then it exploded, and it became the universe. How many of you know that the universe exists? It's not a trick question. Okay. I'm just trying to make a point. Look at the person next to you and say, I believe that you exist. We're here. Self-evident, okay? But we also know that it must have started with nothing. So the question is, what is on the other side of nothing? This first cause, this first instigator of the universe. The ancient Greeks used to talk in their philosophy about the Logos. We've heard that term. It's used for Christ as the Word, the Logos. But that term was in existence before the New Testament. The Logos was a particular term to the Greek philosopher. And the Logos was the first cause. In Greek philosophy, everything that moves, everything within which we have our being, and everything that causes life was started by the Logos. And in the New Testament, it's used for the Word. It's used for Jesus. He is the Logos. So this is their term for the first cause, that in which we move and live and have our being. We also see from Colossians, it says that by Him were all things made. And without Him was not anything made that was made. In Greek, it's emphatic, and it means that without Him, there was nothing, and then He made everything. Does that sound familiar to you? He took nothing and He made everything. By Him were all things made. So let's talk about this first creation. This is what we know. This first cause has to be outside of time. It's not restricted by time. And so therefore, this first cause, by definition, is eternal. There's no time restriction. This first cause also has to be all-powerful, because all of the power that it took to put the universe into existence would have to, by necessity, have come from a being which was not limited in power. It would have been all-knowing, because whatever needs to be known in order to put the universe into motion and to fine-tune it would have to come from something that is very, very intelligent, so He would have to be all-knowing. Does this sound like anybody we know? And then this first cause would have to have a will and volition, because in order to bring the universe into existence and fine-tune the universe in such a way that it can support life, He'd have to have a purpose, which means that He'd have to have a will, which means that He would have to have a mind and intellect. So this God, this first cause, is all-knowing, all-powerful, infinite, and a person. Now, for those of you that love Star Wars, I'm sorry. Because God is not the Force. Negative or positive, dark side, light side. Because the Force of Star Wars is an Eastern religion construct. We'll see this in a few weeks when we start comparing religions. It's an Eastern concept that God is the universe and the universe is God. God is just part of the universe and the universe is God. Wrong. The laws of physics dictate that God cannot be part of the universe. He must stand apart from it, because you cannot create something and be the first cause and be the thing that you created. He stands apart from and outside of that. Now you say, how is it then that God exists? Question. Who started God? Answer, nobody. Well, what do you mean by that? The laws of physics don't apply to nothing. The laws of physics don't apply from the before the beginning. It's something else entirely, and God says this about Himself. He says, from everlasting to everlasting. I am God. In Hebrew, it means from the vanishing point and past to the vanishing point and beyond. I am God. God is not subject to time as we understand it. Now, you can think of it this way, and I found this very useful. Let's say that we are novelists, and we write books, and we put characters in our books. So we write these characters in, and they have lives, and they have things that they go through. They have kids and jobs, and they have all kinds of intrigues, whatever it is that you write in this book. And this goes on for 500 pages, and you've got all these characters in the book. You are no more subject to the timeline of one page at a time than God is subject to your time, because it's a totally different dimension. You can take your novel and go anywhere in that book and be involved with the lives that you've created, because it's such a different dimension that I can go anywhere in this book. I can go backwards, forwards. I can go to the same page over and over. I can do anything I want because it is a totally different time domain. And I am not subject to the timeline of those characters in the book. God is that far removed from time and space. He is removed from it. And so to him, there is no time as we understand it. So he can know the end from the beginning. This is very important as we get into next week, because the Bible is the only holy book in the world that proves that the author knows the end from the beginning, and so therefore is outside of time altogether. Every other holy book, every other religion in the world assumes that God is in time, subject to time, and part of this creation. He is not. The laws of physics say he must be outside, and the Bible's the only one that gets it right. And just a couple of quick thoughts here. The way the universe is designed, the way it's put together, the way that the laws of physics work are so finely tuned that many scientists who started out as atheists have become believers. They believe in God. Some of them have become Christians because of what they understand and what they see. And so let me just give you a couple of quotes. I think you find this interesting. This is Sir Fred Hoyle, one of the more famous British astrophysicists, and actually he started off as a steady-state cosmologist, for those that care. He says, a common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that the super-intellect has monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me to be so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Alan Sandage, he is a prize-winning astronomer, says, I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but it is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something instead of nothing. I like this guy. This is one I pointed out last week. This is Robert Jastrow. He is an agnostic. Which, by the way, so you know this, because I want to give you tools. So you will run against people who will talk to you, and they say, well, I'm not a believer, but I'm an agnostic. I just want you to know. This is two parts of a Greek word. Gnostic is gnosis, which is knowledge. Now, whenever you add an A to the beginning of a Greek word, it means the opposite. So an agnostic is an ignoramus. Okay. They have no knowledge. An ignoramus. Okay. So when you talk to someone, they say, well, I'm an agnostic. You can smile and say, I know. All right, Robert Jastrow is an ignoramus. And he says, for the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been there for centuries. Another professor and a former atheist. In fact, this guy, some of you know who this guy is. His name is Antony Flew. Anybody know who that is? Well, let me tell you. He's since passed on and gone on to meet God face to face. He was probably one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century. He was the guy who all the other atheists wanted to be like. So all of the folks that we've had in our contemporary world who are atheists, they go back to this guy because he was one of the most ardent debaters and one of the most ardent atheists of the 20th century. And he says this, "It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design." He goes on in his book to confess that he has become a believer in God. I don't know if he ever became a Christian, but he got to the point where he realized God is. So this is just a few. And the reason I give this to you is because people may tell you that, science and Christianity are at odds, and you can't be a Christian and believe in science. That's not true. There are many scientists who are believers. In fact, science continues to point to the very fact that God is. Made in the image of God. We are, according to the Bible, made in that image. One of the things that came along later after Einstein's equation, which put kind of a pin in this, is DNA. Now, DNA was discovered, at least the structure of DNA was discovered in 1953. It's not that long ago. But they won a Nobel Prize for coming up with the structure of DNA. Now, before that, biologists in particular were particularly ardent against creation. This goes back to Charles Darwin and before. Charles Darwin, who wrote his book on the origin of the species, was basically laying the case down that mankind and everything else evolved, and they evolved from elements. And so Charles Darwin was, of course, Darwinism, and he's the father of that particular line of thought. That was prevalent. And it was very, very strongly believed in, particularly by these scientists we just talked about. When you get to 1905, this theory had been around for 50 years, and it was pretty well entrenched. And so Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was widely accepted. It caused a lot of havoc, but no more so than in the field of biology. When Charles Darwin wrote his book, and for decades thereafter, the scientific community, as far as biology was concerned, believed that the cells that make up your body, were very simple organisms, relatively. They were made of cell wall and some protoplasm and some amino acids in there. And so it was very easy to believe that those things kind of came from goo and then turned into you. Because they figured, well, if you have enough time and enough material, then you can get anything. If you had an infinite number of monkeys with an infinite number of typewriters and an infinite number of paper and ink and turned them loose, at some point and some time, they could produce the entire works of Shakespeare. There was a huge debate by Wilberforce, who was a Christian. You've heard the name. His dad was the Wilberforce that stopped slavery in England. His son was the pastor and one of the leaders of the Anglican Church, and they had this debate, and one of Darwin's pupils was there, and they debated this, and Wilberforce lost the debate. He lost it based on that premise. Because, first of all, everybody again thought universe is eternal and infinite. And so when the Darwinists said infinite monkeys, infinite ink, infinite typewriters, all of that, then it just made sense, and there was no answer to that. Because the logic of it is, well, given enough time, you could come up with anything, right? Well, now, the universe is not infinite. Now it's finite. As a matter of fact, it's not that old. Even today, I think the new estimate is 12 billion. They're down to 12.6 billion. It was 6 billion, and then it was 8, and then it was 16, and now they're back down to 12 billion. 12 billion years. If you take that, you think that's a long time? No. You take the matter in the universe and the time, and you take those and try and calculate how long it takes for something to come from nothing, there is not enough time. And there's not enough material. You can't get us from goo in 12.5 billion years. So that's a problem. By the way, there was finally an answer to Wilberforce's problem. Another Englishman, A.E. Wilder Smith, back in the 50s, a great man, great Christian, finally answered it in writing and before DNA was discovered and just nailed it from a standpoint of physics and chemistry. What he basically said was this. He had a PhD in chemistry, PhD in physiology. He had a PhD in physics and mathematics, all earned. Smart guy. He was teaching pharmacology to medical students in England, Germany, and in Chicago. He pointed out this. He said that from a chemical standpoint, chemical equations almost always work both directions, which means that chemicals come together and then they go apart. And they happen just as readily. He says, so if you have monkeys, first of all, you're going to have an infinite number of monkeys, but if you got monkeys, what happens is when they push the button down on the typewriter, it puts a letter on the paper, which is a reaction, chemical reaction. When they take their finger off, it pulls the letter off. So they can type all they want. The reaction goes, the reaction comes off. You can't have molecules form when the reactions of those chemicals can change back and forth just as readily. That's one problem. He says, and in chemistry, what we find out from organic molecules is they have a left-handed spin or twist and a right-handed twist. The things with a left-handed twist are poisonous or can be poisonous, and the right-handed ones are okay. And in nature, they tend to come along in about equal numbers. So he says not only does the letter come off the paper when you type it, but from a chemical standpoint, every other key is lethal to the monkey. And so they put it on, it comes off, they hit another key, and they blow up. So you don't have infinite paper, you don't have infinite ink, you don't have infinite monkeys, and every other key will destroy the monkey. You just ain't going to get there. And so it was pretty good. So when DNA was discovered, and they began mapping it, and we still hear mapping it today, what they found out was DNA and the structure of the cell is exceedingly complex. A cell is like a miniature city with factories and mechanisms. I mean, there are all kinds of machines within the cell that produce different amino acids and enzymes and all kinds of things to make that thing work. It's an exceedingly complex system. One biologist likened the cell to a 747. And he said that the 747 is not nearly as complex. And so how could that come about by random chance? Well, it doesn't. And then it gets worse, because the DNA is a digital code. It is a computer program. Bill Gates says that DNA is like a computer program, but much more complex than anything we have ever devised. If you know anything about computer programming, it works on two things, on and off. 0 and 1, right? And so if you have a string of zeros and ones, it forms words and concepts and ideas, and a computer just reads these things very fast, and it starts computing. Computer is digital. Those zeros and ones and the sequence that you put those zeros and one in, they form thoughts which we understand because we have programmed them in to tell us what we need to hear. You understand what I'm saying? That there is a digital relation. Let me illustrate it this way. Let's say that I do this. This is language. This is a digital code. But it's only digital because the writer and the person who reads it have already agreed to what it means. You understand what I'm saying? An A in English is an A because we've already agreed that it sounds like ah. And when I put that with a B, it sounds like ob. If I put an R in there, it's arb. If I put something else in there, it's arbies. Okay? And we've already agreed in advance to what that means. That makes it digital because without that agreement in the beginning, we can't communicate. The reason you don't know what that says is because you are not Vietnamese. If you were Vietnamese, you would look at that and say, when are we going? Because what this is an invitation to lunch. But it's been pre-assigned because the Vietnamese language has been pre-assigned, just like your language, and whatever it is, it's been pre-assigned. So it's digital. The language in a computer is digital because we already want to convey an idea. We put that idea into digital language, and we've already agreed that what it puts out is something that we all understand. DNA is digital, which means that it had to come from a mind, it had to have a programmer, and it is so complex. We have the ons and off. This has 4 letters instead of 2, and it's not just the 4 letters, the 4 amino acids. It's not just the sequence of those amino acids, but it's how the molecule actually folds. It's 3-dimensional. Now, I could have my doctor friend talk about hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a very massive molecule, but it only works because it folds a certain way. If it doesn't fold a certain way, it's 3-dimensional. It's not just the digital code, it's a 3-dimensional digital code. And that's why it works. So how much intellect does it take to create that? Now, how much code is in a strand of DNA? It's been estimated that you could take one DNA molecule from any cell in your body, and you could write 1,000 books, 500 pages per book, but you would have to have a microscope to read the letters. There is so much information in DNA. It's all digital, and it's all designed to build you, to build the bodies, to build the structures, to build the mechanisms that it takes for us to live and survive. This is a computerized digital program that tells us how to build living organisms, how to repair living organisms, and how to reproduce them. Now, you find a computer that can do that. If you do, let me know. I want to buy stock. So these are very, very complex. And so when DNA came along, it was one of the things that just nailed design as the proper view of science. And it has been resisted for a long time. You're seeing more and more scientists coming, as the one I just read, the atheist. Many are coming to faith in God because of DNA. Because the more they study it, the more they realize this could not come around by random chance. There's no way you can get this kind of a code by random chance. It's just not possible. And so many are coming to faith based on that. So DNA, Einstein's equation, universe is finite and had a beginning. DNA says we are made with digital codes from information, by the way, outside of time and space. And so we exist based on that. And I'm not going to get into too much more of this, but just one more thing. Irreducible complexity, you'll hear about this. Basically what that means is your body could not have evolved because there are so many systems in your body that are interrelated with the other systems that each had to come into existence at the same time or they would not function. Darwin's biggest problem was the eye. And they didn't know anything about the eye compared to what we know now. His biggest problem was the eye because how does the eye function? And his answer back in the early days was, well, there was a freckle that showed up that was light sensitive. And then it finally turned into an eye. And he was asked the question, he was asked the question, well, how did it know, how did the brain know what this light sensitive freckle was doing? And he didn't know. Because it's not just the eye getting the information. Your brain has to be programmed to take it and interpret it into what you see. Where did that come from? It comes from the design in DNA. It tells your brain how to function. But the eye is so complex, it could not have come about randomly and step by step. Because there is a whole series of things that go on. And a photon hits the retina, it causes an instant chemical reaction. It's within a picosecond. It's very quick. And there's an enzyme in there that changes shape. And when it changes shape, it kicks another one off, and it goes and it changes shape. And then there's a whole line of things, and it sends a signal, and something else happens. And these things are all going down the line, changing shapes. And then finally it sends a signal to your brain. Your brain gets it and goes, cupcakes. The point is, all of those, I think there's 21 or 25 different processes, all of those things had to come about at the same time, because if you take any one out, you're blind. They had to come about at the same time. So there's this concept you'll hear of irreducible complexity. What it means is you can't be you gradually over time, because the things that God has put into you had to have come about all together at the same time. Another fingerprint of the Creator. And this one, finally, I think you'll like this one. It sounds bad, but you'll like it. It's called non-locality and entanglement. You can hardly wait. You want another cupcake? Okay. Let me set it up this way, because this is very, very fascinating. Very fascinating stuff. Quantum mechanics was something that came along after Einstein's theory, and Einstein didn't like quantum mechanics. He just found out later on that it was absolutely true, and he wasn't happy about that. But quantum mechanics basically deals with subatomic particles, they're very small. Einstein was dealing with the macrocosm and, nature of light and different things that happen in the macrocosm, but the very, very tiny things, the subatomic particles. And what they find out from quantum mechanics is that there's a whole strange world there. And I won't get into all of it. I just want to talk about this one thing. What they've found out is that subatomic particles, photons, electrons, these things, they have a communication system. They talk to each other. They don't know how. And what they did is they did an experiment, and they've since repeated it and done a lot of things to make it true. But let me just give you the upshot of it. What they did is they took something called a double slit experiment. Some of you physics folks know what I'm talking about. So they had these screens, and they had a slit in it. Then they had another one with two slits in it. And then they had a photo paper back here. And they would shoot electrons through this, or they'd shoot photons through it. When they would shoot photons through it, and they wanted to measure back here whether it was a wave, then the way they set up the experiment, the photons would act like particles. And so they would change it, and they would set this up to measure them as particles, and then they would act like waves. And it drove them nuts. But the implication was that the photons knew what you were trying to do, and they were changing. All of them at the same time. And they thought, well, this is too crazy. So this is what they did. They said, okay, we're going to fool the photons. So they just set up an experiment where they shot one photon through at a time. Just one. They measured it on the screen. Then they'd shoot another one. And they'd shoot another one. And when they did it, when they were measuring it as particles, the pattern that these photons would make ended up as waves. One at a time. It's like the photon knew what the other ones were doing. It's like they're talking to each other. And then it gets stranger. You think that's strange? It gets stranger than that. Okay. Then they started to take this a little bit further. If two electrons are produced at the same event, you have an electron that takes off out here, and you got another one that goes out here. Now, without getting too deep in this, because I really don't want to put you to sleep, these subatomic particles, they have what's called spin, which doesn't mean they spin, but they have a certain physical nature. We call it spin. Let's call it green and blue, just to be clear. What we find out is when these electrons are created from the same event, one will be green, the other will be blue. They will never be both blue and both green. They will always be one green and one blue. Here's the problem. You never know whether it's green or blue until you measure it. Because until you measure it, it is neither green or blue. Now, let me give you the analogy that helps. Take a coin. Coin's got heads and tails, right? If you take a coin and spin it real fast, and I flip it across the room, is it heads or tails? Answer? It's both. There's no way to tell whether it's heads or tails until it hits the wall. When it sticks to the wall and you can measure it, it's either heads or tails. Okay, that makes sense, right? That's easy. So you take two coins, they call them electrons, and I take two coins and I'm spinning them, and there's a wall over there and it's got sticky stuff on it, and I shoot them over there, and they both stick to the wall, and now we know what they are. They're always heads and tails. Always heads and tails. They are never both heads and both tails. And what they found out is no matter where these electrons are, no matter how far they are apart, whenever this one shows blue, this one will turn green. They could be 1,000,000 miles apart, and they will change instantly. And the implication here is that what they theorize and understand, in the quantum world, these particles are communicating. They have some connection, but it is outside our three-dimensional space. It is beyond our dimensionality of time and space, because nothing goes faster than the speed of light, but these things will change and interact faster than the speed of light. So they're happening outside of our three-dimensional space. And you say, interesting, but so what? I'm glad you asked. This is a book, this is by Pim Lamel. He is a medical doctor. He is a cardiologist and specializes in surgery. And over his many years as a cardiologist, he had noticed and dealt with a lot of near-death experiences. And so after 20 years or so of his practice, he decided to start setting up experiments with people who were in the ICU or have near-death experiences, and begin to talk with people with near-death experiences. And the book is about all that. It's empirical evidence. It's theory, so he does all these tests and things to see what's going on. And what he finds out is that there are certain groups of people who seem to know what's going on with other groups of people, even though they are thousands of miles apart. Identical twins tend to understand what's going on immediately, and mothers with children. And you think, well, what is that? Well, he goes on and he finds out that this is very true when they start getting into near-death experiences, and then they begin to measure what's going on in the brain. And it's very fascinating. He comes to the conclusion, he says, it appears that consciousness, our mind, call it your mind, consciousness resides outside of the physical body in non-locality, which is the physics way of saying extra-dimensionally. That the brain is simply a transceiver that receives information, that is the volition and will, and sends information about the nature of the environment around it. And that the volition and will and the memories are contained in what we call the mind, and it is outside of the three-dimensional space where the body resides. It sounds like the spirit, doesn't it? God made you body, soul, and spirit. The spirit is after the image of God. You are a spirit housed in a body. And what this guy was beginning to see from empirical evidence, that the real you functions in a dimension beyond your physical body. That the memory, the volition, and the will originates somewhere outside of the physical. And you know, Jesus said the same thing. When his disciples were being beaten up by the Pharisees for eating food without washing their hands, he tells the Pharisees that eating without washing your hands is nothing. It's not important. And then when they leave, the disciples say, what does that mean? He says, don't you understand? He says, what goes into the physical body does not defile a man. What defiles a man? He says, the things that come out of the heart, that's what defiles a man. The physical body has no relation to the heart. The volition and will is the spirit. And Jesus is saying that the physical body is different than the spirit. The physical body cannot be defiled by not washing your hands. What defiles it is your own volition and will, that which comes out of your own heart, what we would call the spirit. So let me read this. I think you'll find it interesting. Quote, complete and endless consciousness with retrievable memories has its origin in a non-local space. That means extra-dimensional. In the form of indestructible and not directly observable wave functions. These wave functions, which store all aspects of consciousness in the form of information, are always present in and around the body. The brain and the body merely function as a relay station receiving parts of the overall consciousness and part of our memories. In this view, these electromagnetic fields of the brain are not the cause, but rather the effect of this endless consciousness. What's he saying? He's saying this. You don't think, I want a cupcake. Your brain doesn't think that. Your brain simply responds to you, your soul, your spirit. You say, I don't care about my diet. I'm having a cupcake. And what he measured, by the way, in some of these experiments, is that the brain reacts some microseconds after, apparently there's some kind of information or volition that comes from an outside source. That's you. You, the real you, says, I want a cupcake. Go get one, and your brain goes, here we go. Right? And then, of course, you say, but you shouldn't have a cupcake. But I want a cupcake. I shouldn't have a cupcake, but you want a cupcake. And your brain's going. So like most of us, we tell that good nature to shut up, and I'm going to have a cupcake. So the point is, it is the you, the volition, the non-material part of you. And we know this is true from the Scripture. There's a non-material part of you, which is eternal. That's your spirit. That's the real you. You're housed in a body. That's why Paul could say, when this body, this tent is dissolved, I have a building made without hands in the heavens. He doesn't cease to exist. He just moves into a new house. And so Jesus is saying the same thing when he starts talking about, if your hand offends you, cut it off. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. And then, of course, if we took that seriously and literally, we'd all be blind and maimed. But he goes on to explain what he's talking about. He said, it's not your hand's fault when you sin. It's the old nature. It's you. It's that non-material part of you, that volition and will that sins. You can't blame your hand for it. If you're a kleptomaniac, you can't blame your hand for taking things without your knowledge or will. You don't walk into a store and say, oh no, what's going on? Oh, where did that come from? Don't put that in the pocket. No. It's not your hand's fault. Your body simply does what your mind tells it to do. And that's what they're saying. And so even in the physical world, in the area of physics, we see this playing out, that everything that's made seems to be able to talk among themselves. And I don't find that unusual, and I don't think that the photons are smart, and they all have a little brain, and they're talking to each other. I think God simply has his creation in such a way that he has it orchestrated. String theory says that all the particles in the universe are simply vibrations in 10 dimensions, which I find interesting because it's like God is playing a song in 10 dimensions and the universe is in existence. We're just basically, the physical universe is just singing God's song. So finally, does God speak to his creation then? Can God get a message to us? Does he speak to us? What does he say? There's always the question, well, why doesn't God just show up and say, hi, it's me? Why doesn't God do that? Does he do that? Does he speak to us? Can God speak to us? Has he spoken to us? Well, I'll give you one answer, and then next week we'll get into the details of that answer. The one answer is yes, he has spoken to us by the things which are made. The evidence is clear. The universe is put together in such a finely tuned manner that no one can deny design. There is a design, and because there is a design, there is a designer. There's never an exception to that. And so we see him speaking to us through his creation. And what is he telling us? He's telling us he is. He's telling us that he exists. He's telling us that he is powerful, that he is eternal, that he is beyond space and time. He's telling us a lot of things. What he can't tell us in the creation is that he loves you. He can't tell us in his creation that sin has separated us from him. And so God does speak to us, and he spoke to us in the most incredible way. He inspired men to write his words, and then he sent his son. So you want to know if God spoke to us? Oh, yeah. So why doesn't God the Father step out into space and say, here I am? We'll see why. As we look at the Bible, it explains why God does not do that. And it answers some of the questions about why he allows suffering. The Bible takes care of that, and he does answer that. And you might be surprised. So here's the takeaways. The universe had a beginning, and it has a first cause. The first cause could not be part of the natural universe. The evidence is overwhelming that the universe shows intelligent design. The natural laws of the universe are finely tuned to allow life to exist. And finally, the findings of quantum mechanics indicate that information is transmitted in dimensions beyond time and space. So if you don't remember anything else, that's what you take with you. And so when someone says, does God exist? You say, well, yeah. I don't know why, but he does. And here, read these notes. That'll help. Well, we're over time, so let's pray. And then Father, we thank you for this time, and we thank you for leaving fingerprints, Father, on your creation. We know that you created all things, but Father, it's nice that science is catching up. So, Lord, we thank you for that. Give us tools. Help us to take these things and use them as you see fit, Lord. Not so that we would just know facts, but that we would also have confidence to be able to proclaim not only that you exist, but that you have a plan for us, that you love us, that you died for us, that you did in fact raise from the dead, and there is a destiny for us. Father, we just ask these things, and we ask that you would guide us and give us understanding in this in Jesus' name. Amen. Have a great week.